Quijano, thank you for joining us. Judge Brett Kavanaugh has been confirmed to the Supreme Court, but tensions over his nomination are far from eased. Key swing vote senators, including Republicans Susan Collins and Jeff Flake, as well as Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, sided in favor of the nominee Saturday. They put Kavanaugh over the top for the appointment, but just barely. The vote was 50-48, the smallest margin for a Supreme Court confirmation since 1881. Kavanaugh will fill Justice Anthony Kennedy's vacated seat. The retiring justice swore Kavanaugh in at a private ceremony Saturday night. Protesters, both in favor of and against Kavanaugh's appointment, demonstrated across the country this weekend. Kavanaugh's confirmation comes just a little more than a month ahead of midterms. What happens next was a main focus of the Sunday morning shows. Here's some of what you may have missed.
I am convinced that Dr. Ford believes what she told us and that she was a victim, a survivor of sexual assault, and that has been a trauma that has stayed with her for her entire life. But we have a presumption of innocence in this country. And when I looked at the lack of any corroborating evidence, including no evidence from her very best friend who was present at the party, I could not conclude that Brett Kavanaugh was her assailant.
I'm happy that those who tried to destroy his life fell short. I'm glad those who tried to overturn the rule of law and replace it with mob rule lost. I've never been more pissed in my life. I voted for Sotomayor and Kagan. I would have never done this to them. This was character assassination. This was wanting power too much. And to the extent that I came to the aid of this good man and helped defeat this debacle, I am happy as a clam.
I do think one of the big things that came out of this hearing was that thousands of survivors of assault who had kept to themselves for years or decades very painful experiences did come forward. And there are things we can and should do on a bipartisan basis to respect and hear and act on the oceans of pain that exist in our country from long buried tragic experiences of assault to try and change our culture and try and change our country.
I'm much more focused on the here and now, which is that we have an election coming up, and I've said to the women who are justifiably angry but determined, and I said they should be just focused like a laser beam on the elections because they have connected the dots. They know that the senators who are making these confirmation decisions are the people who were elected by their voters. And so as voters, they have a role to play.
John Harris joins me now from Washington. He's the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Politico. John, thanks for being with us.
Good morning.
What finally pushed those key swing vote senators in favor of Brett Kavanaugh?
You know, I think if we look back over the whole trajectory of this nomination fight, we see that actually very few votes really switched. There were only a small number that were in play, and not a bunch of them switched sides. I think the fact that he won very narrowly probably did come down to the fact that this became very polarized on ideological grounds, and in the end, Senator Collins is a Republican. This notion that she was agonizing throughout the whole process, I think, was undermined a little bit by her speech, where she was clearly very methodically building an argument to get to yes. I think the fact that she's really a Republican, and Kavanaugh and President Trump did succeed in really polarizing this issue.
Let's focus on the midterms. Democrats are still holding out hope that they'll retake the Senate, but a CBS Battleground poll released Sunday shows they have an uphill climb. For example, in Texas, GOP Senator Ted Cruz is up by 6 points against his Democratic challenger, Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Is the fight over Kavanaugh galvanizing voters ahead of November?
The evidence is that it is doing that. The one point I would add is that this was always likely to happen as we get closer to Election Day under any circumstances. It might be moving up that process of tightening a little earlier than it would have been otherwise. But this notion that Democrats were ever going to be able to compete for the Senate in a big way was always a lower probability. It's still a possibility, but not a probability. The House, on the other hand, I think lots of people really in both parties say that the probability is that this is the year for Democrats to retake the majority.
Well, I want to ask you, John, about a piece that you wrote for Politico magazine. It's really fascinating here. You say that Democrats fear they're the quote-unquote wet rag party. First of all, what does that mean, and how are Democrats trying to counter that ahead of November?
Well, some of your viewers surely saw it. President Trump on Thursday was out campaigning in Minnesota, and he made a reference to that state's former Senator Al Franken, saying that when Al Franken was accused of sexual harassment allegations, he quit right away. He said he folded like a wet rag, and he was almost taunting Franken and taunting Democrats as quitters. There was a group of Democrats for whom this kind of hit close to home because they are people, many of them who served in Bill Clinton's administration, and Bill Clinton himself is known to believe this, that Democrats in a fight need to be tougher and more ruthless because they're up against a very ruthless opposition, and an opposition that's got a very long-term perspective over years and even decades about the pursuit of power. And so I quote a bunch of these Democrats: Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Paul Begala, Democratic strategist Jennifer Palmieri, who worked for Clinton and Obama, to this effect. The one caution I would have is that, in my experience as a Washington reporter, people in both parties tend to think that they've got virtue on their side, but the other side is simply meaner and more ruthless. I actually don't think that's true of either party.
So it's not just a case of Democrats perhaps not being, quote unquote, mean enough, or at least that appears to be sort of the dilemma right now for Democrats.
Well, Republicans have shown that they're willing to defy precedent and they're willing to defy process in pursuit of their objectives. That's what Senator Mitch McConnell showed 2 years ago when he refused to schedule a vote for President Obama's Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland, just let it sit. And we had a vacancy for a year. That did press against precedents, and it did enrage Democrats who said we would never do that kind of thing if the shoe were on the other foot. So it's not really a question of which party is more cynical or meaner, but I do think it's true that Republicans in a very long-term way have said they're going to press every advantage they can, and they've been less interested in sort of an institutional perspective, what's best for the Senate, what's best for the other institutions of government. They've been more focused on what's best for our own personal long-term objectives.
So against that backdrop, Democratic Senator Cory Booker was in Iowa this weekend. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
This is not a time to curl up. It is not a time to shut up. It is not a time to give up. It's a time to get up, to rise up, to speak up. It's time for you not to wait for hope, but to be the hope.
Okay, John, so how do Senator Booker's prospects look for a 2020 presidential run?
Well, look, we honestly don't know. What we do know is that clearly he's interested in exploring that possibility. And we do know that he was speaking or trying to speak to those Democrats I was just referring to, people that feel like, look, we need a fighter. We lost an election that we shouldn't have lost in 2016, and we're up against an opposition in President Trump and Senator Mitch McConnell that is willing to do anything. So I thought Senator Booker's message of, look, don't curl up, let's stand up, is going to resonate with a lot of activists.
Well, soon after Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, Senator Lisa Murkowski, the only Republican to oppose the nominee, said, quote, "It is not a good time in the legislative branch. There's not a lot of public confidence in us at this time." And she later added that the country needs, quote, healing. What is your sense, John, of the reality of the political landscape now? How does the Senate move forward after this?
how does the Senate move forward? How does the Supreme Court move forward? And really, how does the country move forward? I think people in both parties who look at politics through an institutional perspective, that is not focused exclusively on the ideological fight or the partisan fight of the moment, but thinking about long-term issues of governance, know that all the major institutions of government, lots of other institutions in society, the media, business, you name it, have become infused with this sense of radical division and radical polarization. It's not an institutional age. It's a fight-driven age. I think that was what probably was key in dictating Senator Murkowski's vote against Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, and I think it's a sentiment that is I hear widely.
All right, John Harris for us in Washington. John, really appreciate your insight. Thank you.